see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is Dialogues on Building a Culture of Empathy. And I'm here with Howard Zehr, who is a professor of restorative justice at Eastern Mennonite University. And thank you very much for joining me, Howard.
Thanks, it's nice to be here.
And I'm so glad to talk to you about the relationship of empathy and restorative justice. And you're considered the grandfather of the restorative justice, and you've been in it, I guess, since the 70s?
That's right.
So what I really wanted to explore is the relationship of empathy and restorative justice. And we have a conference that is a conference on empathy, and one of the components is on justice, the relationship of empathy and justice. And I wondered what do you see as the relationship there?
Well, in the conventional way of doing justice, the kind of legal criminal justice way of doing justice, it doesn't do much to create empathy. In fact, being an adversarial process, it usually makes empathy even more difficult. That is, the idea for offenders, the need to understand the consequences of their behavior, it's very hard to do in the legal system. We can talk more about that if you want to. Victims may or may not want to empathize in the sense of having compassion for offenders, but they often want to know what makes them tick. Why did they do that? Some of their efforts to restory their lives, to reintegrate meaning, they need answers like that. It's also you have a lot of fear of a person you don't understand. So, but the legal system doesn't give you much opportunity for that. In fact, it sort of discourages that. So when we started restorative justice, we had this kind of gut feeling that we needed to create an environment where offenders could begin to empathize, to understand what they did, and that victims might want to understand offenders. And that's the way restorative justice has emerged. Now, since that time, neuroscience and other kinds of research have confirmed that empathy is a pretty important factor in this. But we were more going on gut feeling when we started.
Yeah, I saw a talk that you just recently gave at the Simon Fraser Center, and you actually had talked a little bit about that. You had talked about kind of the relationship of, I guess you're kind of giving a whole overview of where kind of restorative justice is now. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned kind of the importance of empathy there. And I think there was a quote here I wanted to just say. He said, and as neuroscientist who is looking at restorative justice said, what works is nothing reprograms the brain faster than an experience of empathy because the brain is designed to work that way. We are wired to connect.
Right.
Yeah.
What new attachment theory and new neuroscience is suggesting that our brains really are designed to connect. That's the way we learn the best. That's the healthy learning patterns. And this particular neuroscientist researcher who was looking at restorative conferences says that's why they work. Because if you can create a situation where empathy happens, that reprograms those neural pathways quicker than anything else. Because as you said in that quote, that's the way the brains are designed.
Yeah. So if you kind of look back over your life, is there any kind of a moment where you personally saw and experienced the power of empathy?
You mean in the restorative justice field, for instance? Or
in the restorative justice field or your life in general?
Well, I'm not sure where my commitment to this came from fully. I graduated from Morehouse College in Atlanta, which is an African-American historically black college, and I was actually the first white graduate there, and I learned a lot about understanding the other in that kind of situation. That was when I entered, it was less than 10 years after Brown versus Education had begun to desegregate schools, so some of us didn't have a lot of experience crossing that line. That was a very important influence for me. I went on to teach in Talladega College in Alabama, another historically black college. And that's where I first got involved really hands-on with justice issues. But there have been a number of cases where in the restorative justice field we brought those who had been victimized together with those who had caused the harm and seen some really interesting empathy going on in those situations. And those had a big impact. I had come from a much more adversarial advocacy background, and it was those kind of experiences that really shook up my world and made me restart rethinking what I thought I knew about justice.
Do you have an anecdote about that? I mean, what happened? What was the situation, and how did that play out?
Well, one that I always remember, even though I wasn't the facilitator on it, we had two young men that broke into a house, and it turns out he was a street commissioner, but broke into a house and they burglarized it, and they were caught and came to the program, and they sat down, I believe, in the home with these victims, and as a result of the process, the family that was burglarized said, we want, as an act of restitution, we want you to buy a piece of furniture that matches the decor of our house. And we want that for two reasons. One, we want you to know who we are enough that you'll know what kind of furniture to buy. And secondly, we want to tell our friends that our burglar bought this furniture for us. But the funny thing was, they ended up going shopping together. They went around the counter. They had kind of distinctive furniture, and they ended up going shopping together. And then a month or two later, this woman who was the victim was walking down the street, and who does she run into but one of her burglars? And she says, "How are you doing?" And he says, "I'd lost my job." She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Well, I'm going to go down to this factory down here. I'm going to apply." "Oh," she says, "I know the owner. I'll call him up." So she calls him up and gets him a job. That's empathy. I mean, there was an understanding that came out of that. Their fear level went down, and we found that in our research generally, that when you meet the actual person, whether they're a likable person or a jerk, your fear level goes down. You have a better understanding of why they're doing the crazy things they're doing. So that was one that always stuck out in my mind.
Oops, I was just doing the screen here, and let me just do a little technical thing. Sorry. I was kind of framing you a little bit nicer. There was a little bit of space above your head, so I just put in some framed you. No, we're good. We're good. I handled it here. Yeah. So did you have the vocabulary of empathy? It's like you had the vocabulary. You're developing a vocabulary around restorative justice. But did you use like in situations like in that story, did you say, "Oh, this is empathy that's going on here," or did that vocabulary of empathy come later?
I think it probably came later. That this whole movement started with a particular case in Ontario, Canada, in a small town, where the two fellows began to realize that the court wasn't going to do this any good for these two offenders, and they realized they needed to meet the person and face up to them, and that would be good for everybody. I'm not sure whether they used the language or empathy or not. I'm doubtful they did, but I don't know.
Yeah, because for me, what I've been working on is promoting empathy within society. That I feel that we need a culture of empathy. That we need to take empathy and make it a very explicit cultural value. And I've been to our local mediation center here. You might even know them, Seeds. They're in Berkeley, and been through the training there. And empathy is kind of like woven throughout the training of mediation. But it's kind of like within a container, within a restorative justice container. Whereas what I'm kind of looking at is that restorative justice is like a process for deepening empathy. So Right. It's kind of like coming at it from a little different perspective. And it seems to tie in with what you were talking about in your talk, where you said you were talking about the moral energy or compass of restorative justice. And it's like, what are the underlying values that make up restorative justice? And that's maybe not explored, as much as it could be. You'd mentioned, respect, responsibility, and relationships as being kind of the
Well, values are very important to the field, and there are many values that could be listed and are often listed, and empathy comes up in that. To me, it's kind of a subset of this relationship. That is, it's this understanding that we are interrelated, that we as human beings are interrelated and that our behavior affects other people as well as myself. And to me, the empathy is a bit of that, is part of that. Yeah. And maybe we don't name that as often as we ought to.
Yeah.
I think it's a stumbling block for victims who may be wanting. Restorative justice has had a number of wrong misconceptions around it. One of those is the idea that restorative justice is about forgiveness or reconciliation. And I always say, no, that is not what it's about. It's about meeting the needs of those who have been harmed. It's about holding those who have caused the harm accountable for it, helping them understand, take responsibility for what they did. And it's about engaging those people who have a stake in this, in the resolution of it. If they choose to reconcile or they choose to forgive, that's up to them. Empathy is a bit of a loaded word when it comes to victims, too, because it seems to imply compassion. And while I believe in compassion as a positive value, I don't want to lead victims to try to convince victims to enter this thing as an act of empathy. If I think it will be valuable for them to understand what motivates this, who this individual is, and what motivates. They may end up coming out feeling a certain degree of compassion for the person, but that's up to them. So I think empathy is a bit of a loaded word when it comes to those who have been harmed. It's easier to talk about it with offenders, and then they certainly want empathy when they want the others to understand them. But it's a little bit trickier when talking with people who've been harmed.
Yeah, so that if someone's been harmed, it's like they're wanting maybe revenge, or wanting to be wanting some sort of equalization, some punishment for the person that's kind of harmed them. And it's like thinking about the empathy and developing connection, some kind of a deeper connection with the person that they feel has harmed them might not be what's like really on, on the forefront.
Yeah, they may want to tell the person what they did to their lives. They may want answers to questions. They may want to know what kind of person this is. Often they do, actually. They may not articulate it at the beginning, but they often do. But I've often seen these meetings where there's a turning point in the meeting where both sides do begin to understand the other better. And that is empathy at one level.
Yeah, it's like that story you mentioned about, buy me the furniture that I need. I mean, they can't do that without knowing who the person is and understanding a deeper, the nature of the person that, and the deeper values and tastes and all that. Yeah.
Sometimes restorative practices, as we often know them, are accused of not addressing the underlying social and economic divisions in our society. Some people say, well, the legal system not only ignores these, but turns it into an individual act against another individual act. And it can be argued that restorative justice can do the same thing. But what has interested me in encounters where maybe an offender who was economically marginal met a victim who was fairly well-to-do, the degree of empathy that happened in some of those meetings where this young person began to realize that this person may be wealthy, but they're suffering too. And the person who had the money was beginning to realize, well, now I understand a little better what's motivating this young person to do what they're doing. So that's empathy.
Yeah. Well, for me, the very process that I've seen of restorative justice process, of being in the circle or however it's structured, the very nature of the structuring kind of encourages, it's a form that kind of encourages empathy to happen.
We're trying to humanize this whole process, and the legal system does the opposite. It dehumanizes the process.
Yeah. So I've other people I've talked to. One was Peter Gable. He's been working with Tikkun magazine and is a lawyer as well. And he explained, his explanation to me of the legal system is that we have a legal system that sees everyone is essentially self-interested and greedy in a sense, of wanting to,
right,
and that we create a kind of a gladiatorial system where it's like I have this lawyer who's a gladiator who's going to fight for my interest, and then they kind of battle it out, and somehow truth and some kind of resolution kind of happens within that system. And that's kind of like a very coarse, framing of the existing system that we have. And that an empathy-based system is that part of our nature is to connect, and that we want to create structures that facilitate that connection. So I'm kind of setting it up as kind of dual. I mean, it's two different ways of approaching, the harm and
Yeah. Well, the American Correctional Association has a video they put out to explain to its employees how the justice system works, and they literally draw a boxing match. In the ring is these two proxy professionals, the prosecutor and defense attorney. There is an offender standing on the side. The victim doesn't show up in the diagram at all, and the judge is the referee, and that's how they explain the justice system that we have. If you think about it, the way people commit crimes is by what we sometimes call othering. Instead of empathy for the other, but seeing them as the other, distancing themselves. We have a legal system that increases that tendency to other. And it also increases the othering that we do of offenders. And so it's othering that makes it possible to be as punitive as we are. It's also what makes it possible to go to war. During wars, we always have all kinds of propaganda and other things to other people so that we can do these things to them. I'm a photographer, and I work a lot with photographers, and I've been working with photographers to understand the way our photography tends to other people and how we might use it as a way to make connections instead of distancing ourselves from people.
I just showed your Facebook page as you were saying that, because you have a picture there of you in doing photography. So it sounds like you're trying to take this sense of connection into other spheres of your life. It's also the art can kind of separate people, or it can bring people together.
Yeah, there's a website, an organization called International Guild of Visual Peacemakers, visualpeacemakers.org, that I'm part of, and it's dedicated. It's photographers, journalists, and others who have realized how their photography tends to other people and has committed themselves through an agreement to an ethical framework that will use their photography to bring people together instead of othering them. And I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, well, for me, the bringing people together, kind of the vocabulary I use is empathy. So, it's like, how do we empathize? How do we put ourselves in the other person's shoes? How do we feel, mirror them through mirror neurons? And, create a system, a social system that fosters that. And, one project out there that has just started is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ashoka, but they're a social entrepreneur organization. And they have a goal of bringing empathy training to be part of the core curriculum of, all schools. So you start already at a very young age teaching the tools and the ways of creating empathy. And that would include, it seems to me, already at a very young age, learning all the processes of restorative justice.
That's part of why it's so important to implement restorative disciplinary or restorative practices in school settings, because that's where people learn to use these practices that connect them with other people. But I don't always use the word empathy, but I've done a number of photo interview books. I did one called Doing Life that was photographs and interviews with men and women serving life sentences. I did one with crime victims, and I've done this one with children who are in prison. And my goal is really to get us to see these individuals as human beings, to dialogue with them as human beings, not as some kind of stereotype. So I photographed the lifers, not with bars and not with tattoos, but just with a backdrop, like I would do any portrait for someone. And I'm not trying to make a particular argument there. I just want us to dialogue with people as other people. The victim book is designed so that we can begin to understand what person goes through when they're victimized and how they transcend that process and so forth. So I think empathy is really at the base of my work, even though I don't use the term all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at you'd mentioned about creating a movement. You know, we kind of talked about the values, and part of the next stage seems to be how do we create a movement for promoting this way of looking. You know, looking deeper, seeing the humanity of everyone, and not dehumanizing. You know, not dehumanizing. You know, people who are in jail or maybe have done some harm. Which and so, what are you thinking about? And you felt that from your talk, what I was getting is that it hasn't been terribly successful, you know, creating a movement for restorative justice. And kind of where are you with you know, with that, with creating a movement and how to do that? Because that's very much what I'm looking at. It's like, how do we create, you know, a national, international movement to promote empathy and, you know, extension, compassion in society?
I don't feel like I'm much of an expert on that. I think it does. It does takes a lot of social networking. It takes. We need to talk. I'll find a language that connects with other people. I've tried hard over the years to do that, but I think there's a lot more work that we can be done, and ways to cross the boundaries of disciplines, and that I think is very important. Uh, the restorative justice field right now has kind of a weak infrastructure here in this country. Many parts of the world are ahead of us. The organization that was kind of the central networking organization is kind of defunct at the moment, and so there's other efforts being made to rebuild that. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do on it, and I'm not sure I have the answer how to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if I do either. I kind of doing my best at this, and
But
you
we
know, and the first thing you mentioned was social networking, and that's what I've kind of come across too. Is that the people who are interested in this need to get together and start dialoguing, and that's actually why I kind of reached out to you, as a way of kind of helping to just start creating this dialogue.
and the internet creates huge possibilities on that. I just taught our first online course this semester, and it was for practitioners who had some background in restorative justice, and we had people in Armenia and Australia and Germany and France and here in the U.S. And it was such a networking. I mean, we did it in such a way that people were talking to each other. It wasn't a one-way webinar kind of format. And one of the things we just got the feedback that they liked so much was the networks it created. They're networks that are continuing. They're continuing to talk to each other on Google Plus and other kinds of formats. And so I think we have a lot of possibilities that we have just started to explore.
Yeah, the one part is the networking, which I think we're kind of doing here. And some people have said just start dialoguing about it. You know, generate a dialogue that you can kind of engage others in, and just keep getting it out in the media. And you know, and so that's something else I'm kind of looking at.
But finding a language that'll cross lines of political lines and leanings liberal, conservative, I think that is important. Is to be careful about the hot buttons that get in the way of conversation. Finding a language that allows us to talk, and sometimes restorative justice does that. One of the encouraging things is sometimes we can have a whole spectrum, political spectrum in the room, and find points of connection. But I think we have to really be careful about that we don't use language that's off-putting to some people and so forth. So part of it is searching for a language that connects.
Yeah, so somehow have a vocabulary, a way that doesn't make people kind of trigger things or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and how is it going with that? You know, what does
Well,
that language look like?
Well, I'm not sure what it looks like, but I think we need to explore like the role of metaphors. George Lakoff's book, where he analyzed an earlier election, in the book called "Don't Even Think of an Elephant," he talks about the fundamental metaphors that underlie our political discourse. I think we need to look more at metaphors, find metaphors that work, examine the metaphors we are using. But I can't say that I've gotten very far on that.
Well, that hits a point that really got me excited because I love metaphors, and one of the inspirations for this, you know, for my work and project was, you know, George's work, and so one thing I've done, and you know, which I didn't do here yet, is I asked people, "What is your metaphor of empathy? What is empathy like?" And typically empathy is, the standing in someone else's shoes, looking through someone else's eyes. And for me personally, empathy is like a cornucopia. And everybody has their own metaphor. So I'm just wondering, what is your metaphor?
I don't know if I have one, but the first thing I think about is reaching across a divide somehow. It's a, it's a kind of bridging of a divide that separates people. That's about the best I can do at the moment.
And yeah, that's a good one. I mean, it's bridging a divide in some way, putting a bridge across somehow to the other person.
Yeah.
And a culture of empathy, kind of if we scale that up, is bridges everywhere, or?
Yeah, the only thing trouble with the bridges metaphor, it's such a concrete and steel image. I mean, I'd like to have something a little more organic if I can. I do think that moving toward empathy also means we have to address our own demons and walls. It's and we have a program called STAR, Seminars on Trauma. What's it called? I can't remember what it stands for. But after September 11th, we were asked to funded to start this program to train people on how trauma works in our lives and in our communities, and how things like restorative justice can address that. And empathy is part of that. And we look at the way trauma that we experience gets in the way of empathy. We look at how, when we're traumatized, if we don't get a path out of that trauma, we can also become perpetrators. And so I think that understanding the role of trauma is in our own lives and others' lives is really, really important. A lot of the times, the thing that makes empathy so difficult is the trauma that people have experienced and the responses that they've developed to deal with that trauma. So that's part of it.
It's kind of like seeing all the blocks to empathy, that if empathy is part of our biological nature, there's all these different things that kind of get in the way, and trauma is something that shuts down our empathy.
And sometimes empathy can be a breakthrough for that trauma, but it also, there's lots of obstacles to that empathy in that process. Yeah, I think of one case I was involved in as a facilitator. It was a serial rape case where the woman who had been victimized many years ago really only wanted to tell this guy what he did to her life, that descent into drugs and unemployability, break up her marriage and all that. But when she met him, there was at one point, she said to him, "You stole my childhood." And he began to tear up, and he told me later that's the first time I had ever understood what I did, even though I've been through all the therapy this prison system has offered, which isn't that much. But he said, because that's what had happened to me when my mother left and my father began to beat me. And then I realized the enormity of what I had done. And that was really helpful to her. I mean, she later I asked her toward the end of the meeting, "Did you get what you want?" And she said, "I've gotten everything I want, and I'm at peace now."
Wow.
She wasn't forgiving him. She wasn't saying we wanted to reach out to him, but something had broken through there, and she had some understanding, and he had a much better understanding. He said, "I'm ready now to meet any of the other women who I victimized who want to do that." So that's a case where empathy is a huge part of that process, even though, the woman that was involved may or may not have used the term empathy. It was part of it.
Yeah, it had a sense of restoring connection for her, some sense of connection and having been seen.
Right, and she had some idea who he was, even though he may not be a likable guy. She had some idea where he was coming from and why he might be doing what he did. And that was the other question she asked, is how could you do what you did? And he began to try to understand what was going on in his life, and that was helpful.
Yeah, it seems to be a basic biological need for human beings to be seen. And if we're not seen, there's like a loneliness and an alienation there. And
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and then in a larger, this also brings up for me in a larger sense that if some kind of a crime like that is like an experience of the lack of empathy because the person is objectified, and I've heard some people say like any crime is I mean, and that's kind of a generalization, is like a lack of empathy in that situation. You're not seeing the person.
Right.
And would you do this to someone that you really see? But then it can kind of step back to the fellow that you're talking about, that within society, if society knows that empathy is this important value within society, and society is not nurturing that, then in a sense, it's creating a larger harm that you know. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a larger harm. For example, if he is, as a child or a younger, was not getting the empathy that he needed to develop, and you'd mentioned that before about child development. That it's this important quality in child development. That if the society is not supporting that empathy, then there's kind of like a larger harm that's being done societal wise.
When one of the things people who've been victimized need is a chance to tell their story and to have it heard and acknowledged. It's part of that need to be heard. They're trying to restore their lives. They're trying to incorporate that terrible thing that happened, but they need it to be heard and understood. They need empathy from people. It's part of what it takes to rebuild a life after these kind of traumatic experiences. Ross London is a law professor. He used to be a judge, and he's written a book, and he argues that the fundamental harm of crime is the destruction of trust. That when this kind of thing, we begin, somebody has done something now we can't trust society. When our loved ones aren't as sympathetic and empathetic as we want them to be, our trust is destroyed. And so what the whole justice process ought to be about, he says, is saying to the offender, what are you going to do to regain our trust? And to the victim, what do you need to regain a sense of trust in this world you live in? And that seems to me empathy is a big piece of that.
Mm. Yeah, I've seen trust as like a reservoir of empathy. That's kind of like a little metaphor I have. That trust is knowing that someone will empathize with you in the future.
That seems like a valid point.
Yeah, once I've been to all kinds of different communities. So I went to the Tea Party, to the Republican State Convention here, to the Democratic Convention, to the Occupy, and I've gone to all these different places asking people about empathy. And when I went to the Republican convention, I said, well, tell me, what are your most important values? And there was a couple of young Republicans there, and they said, protection. Anybody hurt me and my family, we're going to protect ourselves. So I just listened. I empathized. I heard. And they said, and it came to, security. We got to have a sense of security. And I said, oh, so security is important. That's right. So then it was like, what you're concerned about, I said, is that there's people out there who are going to do you harm. They're going to like maybe break into your house and, steal your things or whatever, and you want to protect yourself. And I said, yeah. And then it was like, so what you're concerned about is that there's people that will not empathize with you, because if they're empathizing, they're not going to do that harm to you. And it was like, I guess so. It's like, yeah, so empathy is really important. And he said, yeah, I guess empathy is kind of important. And it was like, well, what can we do together to create more empathy together? And, we had a really great conversation. And actually, one of the fellows, he said, my friend was a real selfish, self-centered person, and his mother was dying of cancer. And one of the last things she did was write him this letter, and I have a copy of it. And he pulled out his cell phone, and he said, I'd just like to read it to you. And it was like, son, it's so important that you care about other people, that you think about other people, and you'll see that that's really what's important in life. And he said, this letter changed my friend's life. He's like totally turned into a different person. So it was, in terms of creating a language that you're talking about, is that I think it seems to be, we need to empathize with everyone and then look for those fears and really see how those fears are a lack of trust, and that trust is maybe like a trust that people aren't going to empathize with me, and I have to protect myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, really how to create a language around that is, where are you kind of going with that? Where do you, where's kind of the cutting edge of where you're seeing how to do that?
Well, I think the dialogue processes of various kinds are really, like, I have a friend of mine, he's actually a photographer, but it just happened he started on a story with people on both sides of the abortion issue, and he discovered this group that's been meeting now for a number of years of people on totally opposite sides. But they agreed to have a dialogue, and they began meeting in each other's homes, and they've been going for years. And they don't agree, but they understand where each other's coming from. And some of the most powerful processes I've seen, like, well, in religious circles, often the differences are huge. So in the setting I'm at, one time there was a couple biblical scholars decided they wanted to have a dialogue, and they got all these different biblical scholars of different persuasions together. And what they did is they did a circle, and they had each one tell the story, the formative stories of their life that formed their theological perspective. And they just came out of that with a great deal of understanding of each other, where they were coming from. Instead of being locked into ideological positions, they were understanding them as a human being and what had formed their thinking. And I think those are really exciting processes.
So it's getting the different communities together to kind of dialogue with each other and have a
Doing it
forum.
in a form that's non-threatening, that's
Mhm.
inviting, that equalizes the talkers with the non-talkers, and all of that. That's one of in the restorative justice field, circle processes have been so powerful because they kind of equalize that, since everybody gets an equal chance to speak.
And sometimes it seems that like the gateway into that is where everyone gets to share what their values are and
Yeah,
have those scenes. That seems to be very uh, like a real gateway.
yeah. Commonly in circle processes, if there's enough time, they'll start. Facilitator or circle keeper will start by having each one name the values they want to bring to this conversation, maybe even write them on something in front of them. And so they begin with a discussion of the values. That seems to really shape the conversation.
Yeah. So I'm kind of wondering, what do you think of the overall vision of building a culture of empathy? How does that kind of resonate with you? What is that?
It resonates. I like it. Yeah. I think the thing we have to work around is some of the connotations of the word empathy for some people, and so how to deal with that, I don't know. I haven't given any thought, but the idea that somehow empathy requires you go into it with compassion for the other. Well, yes and no. Sometimes people go into these conversations for their own purposes. They maybe they don't think of it as empathizing with the other person. I don't know. I just think the language is a little bit tricky there,
Mhm.
but I don't have a suggestion for an alternative.
Well, there's all kinds of like criticisms, like empathy is weak, or empathy would be somehow giving up something. You know, that you've got to go into the situation well guarded and protecting yourself, and that somehow, or that that if it's with a person that's done you harm, that you're going to be giving up something. You're not going to get.
Where it's often in the restorative justice field, we invite people to hold the needs and concerns of both victims and offenders equally. And it's so interesting when we have people in the classes I teach who have primarily offender advocacy backgrounds or primarily victim advocacy backgrounds. They'll often say, I just don't know if I can do my job if I understand the other. Now, some of them that have gone through have told me later that they now do their job better because they understand the other. But I think it's a common assumption is that somehow you have to guard your position and not have too much understanding of the other, or it will compromise your position somehow.
Yeah, well, when I've talked to different people within the restorative justice community about empathy, and sometimes I have kind of like a little, I don't know, it's hard to kind of connect. Where some people, that the restorative justice term seems to have a lot of, I don't know, different components. There's like a lack of clarity for me about kind of the nature of it. Like some people say, well, restorative justice is kind of like about bringing two parties together instead of kind of battling it out. With lawyers, they're kind of battling it out, just between each other, and it's kind of like this negotiated. It's a little softer battle, and then and they'll say that's what restorative justice is, and others are kind of more into the empathy. It's actually about people kind of connecting, and so.
Well, yeah, that I wouldn't certainly see it as a battle, even though there may be conflicting interests. That metaphor wouldn't connect for me. But there isn't a agreed upon definition of restorative justice. There's been a lot of debate about where there should be. I personally am worried about reifying it too much. So further be some diversity. But the term has gotten so popular that people are calling all kinds of things restorative. Some of them far off. I mean, I was in Northern Ireland one time where restorative justice is a big thing, and there was a revenge shooting, and a politician was on the radio saying, "We got to stop this restorative justice."
Well, I'm sure the same thing happens with it's empathy. It's like any term, kind of gets used all kinds of different ways, and how do you kind of,
or get some more, it's going to get co-opted.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had corrections people say, the way I get money in my program is I call it restorative justice. Don't change anything, but I just call it, so that's the danger.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of looking at, engaging with the restorative justice community, around empathy, and kind of creating more of a dialogue within the restorative justice community about empathy and the nature of empathy. And for me, it's from the people I talk to, a lot of them kind of come from the legal field. So they always already have a very, and you mentioned it in your talk as well, that it's a very rationalized approach.
Analytic, yeah.
Analytic. And they kind of leave out the, what I would call maybe the emotional empathy or the mirrored empathy. It comes to mirror neurons. That they really focus, and even, they kind of focus on the perspective taking part. And they kind of don't quite see that, the grounding of that is kind of this mirrored empathy. So I'm still, in dialogue, and that's why I'm really, appreciating talking to you, who's been in this field, like you're saying, like they say, a grandfather of restorative justice, to, kind of get this dialogue going around the importance or the nature of empathy and how it really fits.
Well, the legal system is explicitly designed to move emotion out of the process. It's explicitly a rationalized process, and that's the way you're trained in law school, which is why there's been some studies that find that women struggle more in law school because it doesn't fit for them. My classes, I always say this is 50% head and 50% heart. I mean, it's a common injustice is a matter of the heart as well as it is the head. And if it's going to be a real justice, if it's going to be experienced as justice, it's going to involve a lot more than just the head. But that really goes against lawyers' training. So that's always a challenge for not all lawyers, but for many lawyers to make it more encompassing like that.
Yeah, so as I kind of explore this more, I start seeing the landscape a little bit better, like, oh, what's going on? And I can, I'm starting to understand that now. I didn't quite understand. What was it, the resistance I was having, there? There's something that did come to mind is kind of getting a little bit away from the restorative justice is, Barack Obama, he actually ran his campaign pretty much saying, we need more empathy. The country has an empathy deficit. He mentioned it maybe 60, 70 times in interviews, speeches, in his book. And then it kind of came to this climax of when he said he was going to choose a Supreme Court justice, and one of the qualities that he wanted them to have was empathy. And it's kind of like all hell broke loose. Yeah. I mean, you probably don't watch Fox News, but for almost 2 weeks, Fox News had just program after program after program about how horrible empathy was. And so it's like here we have this process, like you were just talking about, our existing justice system with restorative justice as the alternative, and trying to bring empathy into the existing system. And I'm just wondering how you're seeing that whole debate and how that kind of played out.
Well, I don't know if I have anything to add. You're right. I mean, the system is just really designed is very suspicious of empathy. And American politics is pretty suspicious of empathy, I think. So you have a real challenge here.
Thanks.
But that's also why the language we use, that we need to explore more around the language. What are the buttons that this is pushing? Like, it'd be really interesting just to do an interview-based process of some sort to figure out how people understand that word empathy and what associations they have with it, what metaphors it brings forth. Maybe that's the kind of research that needs to be done, so that we understand how to go ahead and move ahead in this movement.
Yeah, well, that interview I did with the young Republicans there, for me, that was very revealing.
Yeah.
For me, it was like one of those, high points in terms of seeing the relationship of making the connection from people's fears to kind of see how the fears are related to kind of a fear of not getting empathy, not being empathized with.
Yeah. Well, the book that Susan Faludi did back in, what was the 90s, called Stiffed, about men. She got in such trouble from feminists for a while because it was empathetic of men, even though she interviewed the real outliers. Her theory was, like pornographers and paramilitary. I mean, people are on the margins, and her theory was you understand the middle of a river by understanding the margins of it. But she got in such trouble because she was sympathetic to the situation of men. We're just not used to doing it. We somehow think that if we have some understanding of the other, it will somehow compromise us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that mentality.
Yeah, that's kind of like the core there. If I'm going to empathize, I'm going to be weakened in my position, and I'll be taken advantage of. And so I have to just keep those walls and those barriers up there and, protect myself.
Or or you won't be able to do your job. People feel that. I mean, when I work with victims and offenders, I mean, you're really torn. I mean, you sit and you listen to this victim, and you can really see their perspective and feel some of their pain. Then you sit with the offender, and you can really see their perspective, and you feel some of their pain, and somehow you're trying to find a way, and it's not all going to match up. I always tell my students that you have to be able to live with ambiguity and paradox if you're going to do this work, because not everything's going to fit together. That's the way the world is.
Yeah. I think to that dynamics, what I'm trying to bring in is this notion of a culture of empathy, which is to take it out of just the conflict. I mean, you'd actually kind of address this in your talk, which is it's part of a larger lifestyle, or a way of being in the world. That it's not just about this moment of this conflict happened, and we kind of just focus in on this conflict, but it's seeing it as in a larger context. So there's the perhaps lack of empathy and connection that happened all the way through school, through our lives, that the stress that parents felt that they didn't have the energy to have, and the stress that the teachers are feeling, teaching to the test and having to suppress their empathy and connection. So it's all kind of connected to a larger value system. That the crime part is just kind of one, really bad manifestation of that whole system.
And it's partly what prisoners, for instance, say is that the problem. What bothers them so much is they're being defined by the worst thing they ever did. And there's much more to them. And I did this project years ago with women whose husbands were in prison. It was a photo interview project. And that's what so many of them said. My husband is being defined by the worst thing he ever did. And would I want to be defined by the worst thing I ever did? No, But that's where the lack of, when we pigeonhole people like that and don't see them as a whole person, that's where the lack of empathy comes in.
Yeah, so again, it's really see the whole person and try to find ways of promoting that vision, that way of being in the world. Yeah. So Well, this has been, wonderful talking to you. Is there any kind of aspects that, you would like to cover that, I didn't kind of bring up or you feel that are important to?
Nothing comes to mind at the moment.
Mhm. Well, I hope we can keep this conversation going. And you had mentioned Sujata, who I know. We've had, lunch together and we've kind of talked about this topic. And
Okay, good. Yeah, she'd be a good person to interview, I think.
yeah, she's on my list. She's been hard to get a hold of, but
Yeah, she really overworked these days.
yeah. So, but yeah, we had a nice talk, and I think she would be. You had a nice story of her bringing people together and creating that connection. So, um, well, I would like to, perhaps do some panel discussions and interview others. Maybe do some cross disciplinary kind of dialogues as well, so we can kind of create, a larger network and kind of keep this dialogue going. So I hope you'll, consider being part of that.
I'll see how it works. Yeah, I'll see how
Okay.
it's going to work.
Okay. Well, then, thank you so much for having, being willing to chat with me about this, and
It's good to talk with you.
good to talk with you.
Glad you know you're doing this. That's great.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care, Howard.
Bye. So much. Have a good rest of your morning.
Yeah. Thank you.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.